This is Cleopatra, a pharaoh, ruler of Egypt. But who was she really? Too much focus on her sexuality, too much on her lovers, not enough about the real Cleopatra. Coming to Berlin in Germany, we can come face to face with this mysterious woman.
Here at the Altes Museum in Berlin, in Germany, they have some of the most amazing Greek art, and they have something that I've really been looking forward to see, a bust believed to be Cleopatra.
There is so much myth around her. Cleopatra's story has changed and evolved over the years so much that we get lost when looking for the real facts surrounding her.
What we're looking at here is a statue from a private villa in Rome, and this is a bust
Believed to be
Cleopatra, Cleopatra VII, the final pharaoh of Egypt.
She is identified as Cleopatra because she was discovered next to a statue of Julius Caesar.
She does resemble the images we have of Cleopatra on coin form. And what's interesting, the images of Cleopatra on the coin form show her wearing this band across her head, the waved hair on the side, and a little bun at the back of her neck. So this very well could be the face of the Cleopatra.
A woman who tried to save Egypt, a political figure, and an incredibly tactile ruler. A figure whose name and legacy is burned into the minds of billions, coming from a tenacious Greek Macedonian family. She had to fight and even kill for her place on the throne, a noble attempt to save a failing Egypt.
Cleopatra was willing to do anything to retain Egypt.
She bore children from two of ancient Rome's most powerful men. She was a writer, an inventor, a scholar.
Thousands of years later, we're still talking either about the men in her life or what she looked like rather than her accomplishments.
She left her mark during the final days of ancient Egypt. The seventh queen in her family to be named Cleopatra.
Let us see if Cleopatra was black or not.
Her story has been warped so much throughout history, from biased opinions to praise. Yet, who was she really?
The heir to the throne had to be of pure Macedonian Greek blood.
Keep her dignity protected.
Everyone thinks they know her. Everyone has a different opinion, but most of those are modern, based on films and misinformed playwrights.
This is the reason why I've been searching for Cleopatra's tomb. I believe she deserved to be found.
How much do we really know about the true Cleopatra? To learn about Cleopatra, we must go back a few hundred years to how her family actually arrived in Egypt. The year was 332 BC. Egypt had been taken over by the Persians, who had made life for the population of Egypt quite uncomfortable. However, Egypt's salvation was on the horizon. A power was rising up against the Persians. This power was based in northern Greece, known as Macedonia. His name was Alexandros, or, as we know him, Alexander the Great. He wanted what the Persians had. He wanted to take over their expanding empire as it was making advances towards Macedonia. Alexander arrived in Egypt and chased Darius and the Persians out. Egypt and Greece had good relations for hundreds of years prior. Ramses II and Nefertari had good ties to Greece, though one Egyptian pharaoh in particular, named Amasis in Greek, or Ahmos II, who reigned around 550 BC, had made allies even more with regions of Greece, and even sent 1,000 talents of gold to help rebuild the Temple of Delphi after it was burned down. He also married a Greek princess, Landice.
It is thought that it is these good relations between the two countries that was the reason why the Egyptians welcomed the Macedonian Greek Alexander into Egypt with open arms, uncontested. He was then crowned pharaoh and named as the son of the god Amun.
However, some suggest that a mythical tale imagined in around 150 BC tells us that the last Egyptian-born pharaoh, Nectanebo, had not fled south from the Persian invaders, but rather north into Greece, where he disguised himself as the god Amun and impregnated the mother of Alexander, thus conceiving Alexander the Great. This story is merely a myth and holds no historic merit, though some say that it was because of this tale that the Egyptians welcomed Alexander. Alexander adopted Egyptian custom, representing himself as a pharaoh, a title that he was most proud of. Alexander only stayed in Egypt a few months, founding the new capital city named Alexandria on the Egyptian Mediterranean, and building several small additions to existing Egyptian temples. He left Egypt, went to Persia, and beyond. When Alexander returned to Babylon in 323 BC, he mysteriously fell ill, and shortly died after entering the city. With his recognized son not yet born, the rulership of Alexander's empire was split up between his courtiers. The half-brother of Alexander ruled Egypt for a few years, with the then infant son of Alexander, named after his father, being only a figurehead and not a real pharaoh. Alexander IV was killed at age 13, and shortly after, another illegitimate son of Alexander the Great was also written out of the story. Other Macedonians made attempts to conquer Egypt, but it was Ptolemy I who was crowned as pharaoh from Cyprus.
Ptolemy I, he was Macedonian Greek, but after him it starts getting messy and confusing. And this is because brothers were marrying sisters, uncles were marrying nieces, and fathers were marrying their stepdaughters, and in between these marriage unions they were also killing each other.
Ptolemy I was an army general of Alexander and his personal bodyguard, and showed great support for the followers of Alexander who defended Egypt, and some vague historical accounts mention Ptolemy was a cousin or even a half-brother of Alexander. Thus, Ptolemy became pharaoh of Egypt and founded the Ptolemaic dynasty. The family that gave us Cleopatra VII.
To add further to the confusion, the men were all called Ptolemy, and the women were either Arsinoe, Berenike, or Cleopatra. So our Cleopatra is actually Cleopatra VII.
Many years later, after the start of the Ptolemaic dynasty, their final pharaoh was about to emerge.
Cleopatra's family tree is very complicated. In fact, to say it's complicated is an understatement. It's like navigating your way through a complex maze full of twists and turns and dead ends, and when you finally make it to the end, you're more confused and wonder how you got there.
The year was 69 BC. Cleopatra VII was born. She was said to become the most revered of all the Cleopatras.
A very ambitious queen, a very intelligent queen, that she did learn languages. Was amazing. In that time, only men can go to study.
Cleopatra was formally educated, most likely at the great learning center known as the Museum. Cleopatra was the first of the Ptolemaic ruler who spoke Egyptian.
She was born in Alexandria, Egypt, the only Ptolemaic ruler who learned and spoke the Egyptian language. So for me, in a way or another, she was an Egyptian queen. To me, as an Egyptian, this is how I see Cleopatra.
Cleopatra, she was a unique person, and she wrote the hieroglyphs, by the way. And Cleopatra, she spoke, for example, Aramaic, Hebrew, ancient Egyptian language, Greek, Latin, and she cared about all the kind of knowledge, astronomy, philosophy of ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, and also the religion of ancient Egypt. She knows all the gods. She has like large knowledge about ancient Egypt, and the lady, she had a dignity.
Cleopatra had the best education available. During the Ptolemaic period, Alexandria became the cultural hub of learning, and it all began with the vision of Ptolemy I. He wanted to amass education and knowledge from all over the world and have it in one place, and I think he got pretty close to achieving this. Alexandria attracted scholars from all over the world, some of the greatest minds ever. And during its peak, the Alexandrian library amassed about 500,000 books. Every time a ship would come to the Alexandrian harbor, if there were any books on board, they would take these books, get them copied, and then return them back to the owner. Egypt, apart from grain, also controlled the paper trade, so they became the greatest exporters of books. There was a whole institutional complex where they could gather, and some of the greatest minds would share their ideas. The Ptolemies wanted to make sure that they stayed there, so they gave them great living standards. So this is the social, educational environment in which Cleopatra grew up, and she thrived in this environment and excelled. And I think she was a bit of a child prodigy, and her father, Ptolemy XII, saw something special in her from a very young age, and he therefore trained her to become the next pharaoh. He trained her to become fantastic at public speaking, and she managed to learn 9 languages. That's remarkable. And Plutarch tells us that she flowed from one language to another with ease, and she spoke them beautifully, which makes me think that she learned these languages from a very young age. And not only did she excel in languages, she would have learned literature, astronomy, mathematics, and it looks like she had an interest in medicine as well, because there are some medical treatises which are assigned to her in dermatology. So she was a very exceptional, intelligent woman.
Cleopatra's parentage is widely disputed. Many ancient sources have various opinions. Her father, Ptolemy XII, Auletes, was the son of Pharaoh Ptolemy IX. Oleti's mother is disputed. Cleopatra Selene is suggested, as it is known that she bore 2 children. His second wife, Cleopatra IV, is a candidate, but it is not certain. The ancient writer, around 100 BC, Pompeius Trogus, has referred to Ptolemy Auletes as the bastard son, while Cicero makes mention of a half-Greek, half-Syrian consort being the mother of Auletes. This would make sense, as Auletes spent most of his life in and around Syria.
He wasn't that popular with the Romans. They didn't really, they hurled a lot of abuse his way. One of the insults that the Romans particularly enjoyed was to call him the illegitimate. Now, I've toned it down, but they said this quite a lot. Cleopatra I was actually born in Syria. She was the daughter of the Seleucid king. Her mother was Greek and Persian, and she married Ptolemy V. Now, Ptolemy V's claim to fame is the Rosetta Stone, which, of course, is responsible for the decipherment of the ancient Egyptian language. So on this stone, he basically lists all his accomplishments, all the good deeds he did. He's basically letting us know that he was a great guy. And him and Cleopatra I have a daughter, and this is now Cleopatra II. But Cleopatra II goes a step further in that she marries both her brothers. So first she marries Ptolemy VI, and then when he dies, she marries Ptolemy VIII. She has children from both her husbands. One of her daughters is Cleopatra III. We on to the third now. Cleopatra III ends up marrying her uncle and stepfather, Ptolemy VIII. And by this stage, Ptolemy VIII is married to mother and daughter. It gets very confusing. And then Cleopatra III, she has a daughter who is Cleopatra IV. Cleopatra IV is killed off by one of her sisters. And then we've got Cleopatra V and VI, who are a little bit more obscure.
The Ptolemaic dynasty never conceived out of their own bloodlines. A noble foreign woman would have been looked down upon, but ultimately seen as passable. Cleopatra VII's mother is also a matter of theory and opinion. 2 women are strong possible candidates. Cleopatra V, also known as Tryphania, was the sister and wife of Ptolemy XII, Auletes. When they were married, a papyrus mentions their joint titles as Theo Philipatros kai Philadelphoi, which means of the father, brother and sister, the loving gods. She is also mentioned at 2 temples in Egypt, at Philae and at Edfu Temple, where she is called the daughter of the sun, mistress of the 2 lands, and female ruler. It is highly probable that her mother is the same woman as her brother.
Cleopatra V, her father was probably Ptolemy IX or Ptolemy X, but she's believed to have married Ptolemy XII, who is Cleopatra VII's father. Cleopatra V disappears from the records shortly after Cleopatra VII is born. So it could be that she died in childbirth, it could be that she was exiled, or perhaps she just didn't do anything that remarkable to be written about.
In 305 AD, the philosopher Porphyry talks about Cleopatra V dying in 69 BC during childbirth. This would have been the birth of Cleopatra VII. He goes on to mention that a daughter sharing the same name went on as co-regent while the father of the great Cleopatra was exiled to Rome. Strabo's account contradicts this, saying that Cleopatra V was the one who co-ruled with her daughter Berenice, while Ptolemy was exiled to Rome. Other texts suggest Cleopatra as having a half-Greek, half-Egyptian mother, who was a priestess of Ptah. Others suggest her mother was a half-Greek, half-Syrian woman that her father had known. Neither of these two women can be confirmed to having ever existed.
Do you think that it would have been okay for them to have concubines because they were so focused on keeping the bloodline within the family? The inbreeding was off the hook. I mean, Tutankhamun was also a victim of
Completely inbred. Do you think they were allowed to have concubines?
No, I'm not aware of it, and what I am aware of is that always the heir to the throne had to be of pure Macedonian Greek blood. Yeah. So even if they had concubines on the side, the children of these concubines probably got nowhere in life. If her mother was an Alexandrian priestess, I don't think Cleopatra would have had the access to the throne.
The Syrian mother theory holds more bounds, since this is where Cleopatra fled to after conflicts with her brother. Yet the candidate of the wife of Ptolemy Auletes, known as Cleopatra V, is more likely considering the amount of inbreeding to keep the bloodlines pure.
So if Cleopatra was illegitimate, the Romans would have been shouting this from the rooftops, because the Romans that are responsible for her history are Romans that either detested her or had their own biases or their own agenda. And there isn't a single writer that says she was illegitimate, which means that she must have been born to Ptolemy XII's wife. So the only wife that we really know of is Cleopatra V.
If her mother had died in childbirth, then why should there be any mention of her? If her mother did oust her father and herself to Rome, why would there be any mention of her as a disgraced member of the family who turned on her own relations, as was a custom of the Ptolemaic rulers?
Let us see if Cleopatra was black or not.
The big question.
You know what I'm going to say? First of all, I am not against the black at all. But I would like to give facts about Cleopatra. Because look at the Macedonian queens and Macedonian princesses. There is no one who was really black. At the same time, look at all the statues that was made for Cleopatra. At least I know about 2 statues for Cleopatra. And all the coins that I discovered inside with Kathleen Martinez, the temple of Butoziris Magna, it does not show at all that Cleopatra was black. And I want to come to a very important point. It is not good to change history. It is not good to make a false history. Again, I am not against the black at all. If Egypt history was black, I will say that. But let us see if anyone will come and look at the scenes that's shown on the temples of the New Kingdom and the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom. You always see the king smiting the enemies of Egypt. And the enemies of Egypt were actually Asiatics, African, and Libyan. Then you have 5 people in front of him. If you look at the face of the king and the face of the other enemies of Egypt, there is no one can say that the Egyptians were black at all.
showed themselves as unique, as
Yes.
Egyptians.
The Egyptians were unique and they were different. We know in Dynasty 25, we know that Cush and Nepta ruled Egypt. And we have the first king who came was Banchi and Taharka and others. Then the black kings came to rule Egypt in the late period. They did not have anything to do with this great civilization, such as building tombs and temples and pyramids. If you look at the Meroitic pyramids that built in Sudan, it's not like the great pyramids that built in Egypt. Then we have to know that the black civilization, its origin was in Sudan and Nubia. And I would like to mention here, there is some people who tried to show that the origin of Egyptian is black. For example, we have two people from Brazilian came to the Civilization Museum and they took a photograph of a skeleton that was found in a small village near Sohag in Upper Egypt.
33,000 years old skeleton, which I had the opportunity to CT scan as well. He walked in quarries, and we can tell that from the changes that his work caused on his elbows as well as in his knees and patella. These are of the oldest skeletons in Africa.
These two Brazilians took photographs of the skeleton, and they went to Brazil and produced a false scenario that this skeleton was black. How can anyone on earth
It's not scientific.
find out if this skeleton can be black or white?
Mhm.
Also, when I was visiting Brazil, they do every year a parade. In this parade, it's celebrating that they are the origin of the Egyptians, but that's not true. Again, the black Kushite and the people in the south ruled Egypt in the late period, which is Dynasty 25. I remember when I went to give a talk in Philadelphia, and I did say what I'm saying now. Many blacks were very upset with me, and they had a march against me. Again, I am not saying at all, I'm not against the black at all, but most of my good friends are really black. But I want here to say the truth, that Cleopatra was not black.
Según todos los vestigios arqueológicos, Cleopatra era de la raza caucásica. Tenemos las pinturas, los relieves, las estatuas de la gran reina de Egipto, Cleopatra. Todos confirman que Cleopatra fue de la raza caucásica. Con todo el respeto a la raza africana, Cleopatra no era africana. Cleopatra era caucásica. Y para dejarlo más claro, la raza caucásica es la raza que habita el norte de África, el sur de Europa. Cleopatra lo era. Cleopatra era de Macedonia originalmente y nació en Egipto. De nuevo, según todos los vestigios, Cleopatra era egipcia, era de la raza caucásica del norte de África.
Coins from her time would show her with typical Greek facial features.
There is a debate over who her mother was. Her mother might have been an Egyptian priestess from Alexandria. Here is where the debate comes. Ancient Egyptian does not necessarily mean black. Ancient Egyptian society was a multiracial society, the same way it is today. We are a multiracial society. Excluding Egyptians that are not of the darker skin tone from their heritage is not okay. And Africa is a huge continent. Africa is not only black. I'm Egyptian. I'm quite dark, but I have cousins and family members that look like you. They have colored eyes and they're white and they're still Egyptian. If we look at the Fayum portraits, for instance, the Fayum portraits for a long time, they were thought to belong to Greek inhabitants of Egypt. But recently they did DNA tests on the mummies where these portraits were placed on, and they all turned out to be Egyptian. And Egyptians came in all shapes shades and in all colors, from very dark to very light. And Africa comes in all shades and all colors. Culturally appropriating a civilization or a culture to a certain specific skin color is not acceptable.